Welcome to the program. Well, this week has been a reminder of the strange political climate we live in at the moment. Today, Tony Abbott unveiled a policy promising virtually no significant change on the industrial relations front for at least the next 3 years. That's right, a Liberal leader saying that unfair dismissal laws, penalty rates and the rest will stay until at least 2016. On the other side, the Labor side, we've seen commitments, budget commitments broken, such as an increase in family payments and a promised tax cut to compensate for the carbon tax. This just 4 months out from an election. So what's going on? How to make sense of it? Hopefully our panel tonight can provide some answers. We've got a bit of economic brain power around the table. Andrew Leigh is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister and a former economics professor. John Hewson is a former economics professor as well and a former Liberal leader. Jessica Irvine is the National Economics Editor for News Limited and has honours in economics from Sydney University, as does Paul Fletcher, Liberal MP from Sydney as well. Welcome to you all, economists one and all. I'm the most undereducated in the room. Let's start with industrial relations. And Paul Fletcher, honestly, what is Tony Abbott trying to do with this policy?
Well, the focus of the Coalition's policy announced today is to ensure that the position of workers is protected, but we're not interested in protecting the position of the union bosses. So, for example, the unions have increasingly been exploiting the expanded right of entry, which has been given to them by the Rudd-Gillard government. One example quoted in the policy today is that on a major resources project in northwest Australia, the CFMEU exercised a right of entry over 200 times in 4 months. Now, that has serious productivity consequences.
So how many times should they be allowed to enter?
What we've said is we're going to wind the position back to where it stood in 2007 on the specific question of right of entry.
Which is how many times?
And the key issue is the linkage between the union and the employees. So at the moment, that's been greatly broadened. We've also, for example, indicated that we're going to toughen up the supervision of registered organisations. We've seen, for example, with the Health Services Union, some appalling mistreatment of the low-paid members of that union, their money being squandered on things like prostitutes and personal expenditures of union officials. I can
understand you wanting to, beat up on the unions and use that example. But getting back to the first part of your answer, you said this is about protecting workers. Is it in the best interests of workers to have the current framework of penalty rates, leave loadings, unfair dismissals that in years gone by Liberals have railed against? Is it in the workers' best interest to have all of that stay for at least another 3 years?
Well, look, what we've said is that the Fair Work laws are reasonably new in their operation, but we're going to have a review. We're going to ask the well-respected Productivity Commission to conduct a review in our first term of government.
Just to get you through this election?
No, to ask the question, are there aspects of those arrangements that could work better. Now, Labor had a review some months ago. It wasn't a very serious or comprehensive effort, so we want the well-respected Productivity Commission to conduct a review of these arrangements. But what we also want to do, for example, is...
But surely you can make these decisions on your own. I mean, you've been around and your colleagues have been around and looked at the workplace for a long time. Why do you need to park this policy decision-making with the Productivity Commission?
I don't think referring something to the Productivity Commission could seriously be described as parking it. The Productivity
Commission... But you guys can make up your mind about this,
The Productivity Commission is a well-respected body which both sides of government have consistently referred issues of
when
this
issues
kind
become too politically difficult to deal with themselves.
As part of a policy development process. We've seen it, for example, on the question of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. We've seen it across a whole range of areas that issues go to the Productivity Commission. So what we've said is we want to have the Productivity Commission have a careful look at these issues, but there are a range of changes that we're making. For example, Labor has so-called individual flexibility agreements under its legislative arrangements for the workplace. Now, in practical terms, those have been quite difficult to use because if there's an enterprise agreement, the unions can effectively override them. So what we want to do is give workers the capacity to draw on the provisions that are contained in Labor's own legislation, because it's about protecting workers, not about protecting union bosses.
Dr Andrew Leigh, what's wrong with that?
Well, David, I think all of us at the table as economists would share the goal of raising productivity. And you can see pretty clearly in the aggregate data the relationship between workplace reform and productivity. Under work choices, which Tony Abbott says was good for workers, productivity in Australia, productivity growth was at an all-time low.
But we're not talking about work choices now. What's wrong with the policy they've put on the table today?
The coalition are creeping back as close as they can get to work choices.
How are they doing that?
Well, there's certainly moves back towards individual contracts.
But just to be clear, these aren't individual contracts. These are the individual flexibility arrangements that you've already got in place.
Well, the coalition would like to see the reinstatement of AWAs under another name.
Well, they've said expressly no, that's not what they're trying to do.
I think it is. This is a very high-level document, David. It is. There's looking between the lines, putting this with the past statements of the Leader of the Opposition. I think it's pretty clear.
But hang on, just to be clear, in the policy document today, it makes it expressly clear they're not talking about individual contracts, statutory agreements, AWAs. What's in between the lines that's not in the actual policy document?
Well, I think the reference to the Productivity Commission is a pretty clear attempt to move back towards that. But just to get...
But hang on, are you conceding here that they are doing individual contracts or not?
So let me understand this economist opposed to the productivity.
My sense from reading this document, putting it together with the Leader of the Opposition's past statements about his views on work choices, is that this is a move back towards work choices.
Isn't that the scare campaign, fully fledged? It's not there in the document. Tony Abbott stood there in front of the cameras today and guaranteed there wouldn't be individual contracts. But you're saying, oh, no, what he really means is individual contracts.
We know that whenever the coalition are talking about industrial relations changes, that employees are not going to get better leave loadings. They're not going to get better penalty conditions. They're not going to have more protection from unions. That's pretty clear. But going back to the productivity point, we also know that this isn't going to be good for productivity. The lousiest period of productivity growth in Australia was under work choices. Productivity has been ticking up since work choices was abolished, and we've also seen now in Australia an unemployment rate that came down a little today is less than half the unemployment rate in Europe.
Sure, OK.
There's no better country in Australia than Australia to be looking for a job.
Let's stick to the facts of what is and isn't in this policy. Jess, what do you make of it? What are the policy offering Tony Abbott's produced?
Just to pick up on the point of productivity, I think we need to be careful not to get confused between correlation and causation. I guess with productivity, we're talking the mid-2000s being the period of work choices, which was also when Australia's mining boom ticked up, and we had a lot of investment that is yet to show up as output. So I think it's very hard for us to make arguments about the impact of workplace relations on labour productivity from those numbers, don't you think?
I agree, Jess, but I think it's the other side of the argument is often made, which is that work choices was great for productivity, and the argument being made a couple of years ago was the real problem with Australia's productivity is that we got rid of work choices. In fact, now we've had this sustained uptick in productivity. I think at least there's some evidence that if you want to improve overall living standards, which I think is the productivity agenda, that a return to work choices isn't the way to do it.
Well, John Hewson, let's just hear from you on this. Has productivity ticked up, and does it have anything to do with industrial relations?
Look, I agree with the point that Jess just made, and I just step back a bit and say, look, this is a political document. It's not an economic document. We ex-professors of economics and so on try to find some economic merit in this. The fact is it's a political document. It's a very carefully crafted, very cleverly crafted document. It focuses on the weaknesses of the current system. It provides a mechanism by which the bigger issues can be looked at, the Productivity Commission review. I think if you look at it objectively, the pendulum has swung pretty heavily in favour of the union movement under the Rudd-Gillard government. This swings it back towards the bottom, focuses on some of the excesses of the union movement, whether it's by way of access to the workplace or whether it's because of the behaviour of some union officials to the detriment of the workers. But I think in all up, it's a political document. The timing of it is very clever as well. Put it out just before the budget, and it's in there. You can't say Tony hasn't got policies. He's putting them out all the time now. And in those terms, by the time you get to the election, it will not be an issue. And I don't think you can sustain the work choices argument against this.
This isn't
in fact,
work choices,
I watched Ed Carney today. I mean, it sounded pretty hollow, standing there repeating the same line over and over at a press conference. Nobody's going to believe that because it doesn't go back to work choices, doesn't even make any move towards work choices.
Can I just pick up one of the points that Andrew made there about the importance of productivity? I think that's something we all agree with. We know Australia has a productivity problem. We know we need to improve in terms of productivity. One of the key thoughts underpinning this policy is that there were measures in Labor's package, which has been in place now for a number of years, which purportedly are designed to improve productivity. For example, the notion of the individual flexibility agreements and the greenfields arrangements. So the idea is when you're setting up a major enterprise, you can structure the industrial relations arrangements in a one-time process. If all of that works as it should, there are benefits there. Unfortunately, the point we're making is because of how it's operated in practice, it hasn't worked as it should.
So
what we've been trying to do...
These fairly minor changes that Tony Abbott's making today on greenfield sites, which would set a 90-day limit on how long the negotiations can run.
Yes, that's right. So at the moment, in practical terms, the unions can effectively spin out a greenfields negotiation. What we want to do is say, let's have a 3-month deadline. If an agreement isn't reached, then it goes to the Fair Work Commission.
So we're doing that, and then also encouraging more use of these individual flexibility arrangements, which aren't quite... Well, they're not individual contracts. They sit on top of the award conditions, unlike the AWAs. Will that boost productivity? Is there any sort of guarantee you can give on that?
Well, I guess the point I'm making is that these are measures which are stated to be about achieving some of those objectives, but they've been constrained in the way they've worked under Labor, so we are going to make some changes to give greater effect to them.
So that's no guarantee?
Well, what we're saying is we believe this is going in the right direction in terms of productivity improvements, and we're also saying let's have a thorough look at it with the Productivity Commission conducting a review, and who better than the Productivity Commission to do it?
Jess, well, to both John Hewson and Jessica Irvine, what should happen, putting you know, the ideological and political differences aside? What do we need? John Hewson, first to you, perhaps.
Flick that back this way. Look, I think there are some elements of this package that will enhance productivity. I mean, the parental leave scheme definitely will enhance productivity, in my view.
Tony Abbott's plan.
The flexibility that's proposed, that will improve productivity. Maybe not a dramatic revolution in productivity, but it's in the right direction. There's steps in the right direction. And, you know, I think if you step back from this, we've had a pretty tumultuous period of industrial relations, going back to work choices, the impact that had on the workplace and on industrial relations more broadly. And now the economy is actually slowing down a lot more than is being admitted. I mean, we're seeing the revenue numbers chasing the economy down. And in those circumstances, I mean, you don't want to go in and disrupt the workplace too much. You've got to settle things down and establish a base from which you might re-establish sustainable growth. But right now, we're going to go into a very difficult period in this economy. And despite what is being said, yes, relatively we're in great shape compared to the rest of the world, but our cost of living is about double what it ought to be. Our productivity is about half what it ought to be.
But on this policy,
too high.
It sounds to me like you think Tony Abbott's nailed it. He's hit the right mark here. He shouldn't be going any further. As some in business,
no, I think. Look, let's see what comes out of the Productivity Commission review.
But that'll be a long way off before any change comes out of that.
I mean, it is better to have some of these issues objectively assessed than to have, get lost in the day-to-day media contest between both sides of politics, which doesn't actually focus on the detail, doesn't have the capacity to focus on the detail of the arguments we're looking at. And in the medium-term sense, we may move. I think you can see a move of the present system more in the direction of flexibility, more productivity enhancing, but that will take time. Right now, I'm happy to see the system stabilise.
Jess, do you agree we need eventually more flexibility in how workers and bosses negotiate?
I don't see a problem at the moment. I think what we've seen over the last couple of decades was this deregulation of the workforce, not centralised wage negotiations. We did that, and it just seems like we tipped over the balance a little bit with work choices, and there was admission on both sides of politics that we needed to wind that back a bit and just have this period of stability. I don't think many economists, when they look at the top things we can do to enhance productivity in this country, I don't think messing with labour relations is actually one of those at the moment. I think building infrastructure, helping women stay in the workforce.
Actually supporting universities instead of cutting them.
Investing in education.
Can I just pick up one point on building infrastructure? The cost of building is an issue, and a major factor over the years has been some very, very troubling behaviour that we've consistently seen on building sites, some frankly pretty thuggish behaviour. Now, the Howard government established the Australian Building and Construction Commission following the Coal Royal Commission, and that delivered significant productivity improvements, nearly a 10% productivity improvement. Unfortunately, responding to its union masters, the Rudd-Gillard government chose to abolish the ABCC.
Well, Andrew Leigh, why did Labor get rid of it?
Our view, David, was that it didn't make sense to have this as a separate body. It had its investigatory powers are extraordinarily broad, and I think inappropriately so. I also take the view that if the coalition is going to reinstate the ABCC, I'd like to know where the money's coming from. This is a tight fiscal environment, and as somebody who keeps half an eye on coalition costings, we didn't see any budgetary announcement attached to the coalition.
We can't afford to have a watchdog on the building industry.
Well, first of all, I don't think it makes sense to split this out from Fair Work Australia. Secondly, though, if the coalition is intending to do things which increase the cost, I'd like to see them be upfront with the Australian people about the cost. That's going to have to come from somewhere, either from increased taxes, lower spending elsewhere.
I think, Paul Fletcher, one of the strongest arguments is touched on here against the ABCC. Why should building workers face a different justice system to the rest of us?
Because of the clear track record of what has happened in the building and construction industry over many years, and we're seeing it again with the CFMEU up to its old tricks. And so we have promised to restore the Australian Building and Construction Commission because it's about getting back to productivity in a very important sector, and a sector which unfortunately has had a poor track record. Now, we hear this argument about we can't have a separate body. While we're talking about separate bodies, let's talk about the Road Transport Remuneration Tribunal.
Do we have to?
Well, this is a separate body that was set up by the Rudd-Gillard government in response to pressure from the Transport Workers Union. There's no demonstrated linkage between remuneration for truck drivers and safety.
Let's hear the quick response on that.
Paul has talked about these two sectors from the point of view of bosses' costs, but I think we also have to recognise these are two sectors with very high fatality rates. There are too many truck drivers who die every year on the road. There's too many building workers who are injured, and there's been building workers in my electorate who have had horrendous injuries happen. Much of the union activity in these two sectors has been around making sure that when workers kiss their kids goodbye in the morning, they're going to be home at night. Those safety concerns arise in these sectors, and that's why unions reasonably want to make sure that safe rates are paid to truck drivers, that good safety standards are maintained on building sites.
That was not what the Coal Royal Commission found. It found serious issues in the building industry, and that's why we say that the ABCC ought to be re-established. And the evidence in relation to the linkage between pay and road safety is extremely thin. What's been created is a separate body, which essentially is a separate way of determining remuneration in the road transport industry, indeed a former worker or former assistant to TWU Secretary, National Secretary, said just recently.
OK, I think we'll leave that issue there. We're going to have to take a break. After that, we're going to get into the budget coming up next week. We're already seeing some things being cut and shelved, and what's this going to mean for the Abbott opposition as well and their paid parental leave plan? Stay with us.
Please, come on in. But only because it's you, Mr. Clooney. Please come in, but only because it's you, Mrs. Martin. Voluto as usual.
When I come here, I always feel like a star, don't you?
More or less.
You're a shredder, Mr. Clooney?
Thank you.
When I tell you.
Nespresso.
What else?
Christine's APIA experience, taken from a real claims conversation.
Hi Christine, just calling from APIA. Are you happy with everything?
Oh look, I couldn't have been happier. I just made one call and it was all organised. The taxis were there and the car was fixed perfectly. I was constantly updated with everything.
Fantastic.
I was able to get back to living my life.
That's great to hear, Christine.
If you're over 50, we like to reward your experience. Call APIA on 13 50 50 for a chat today.
Mazda has put a lot of energy into the all-new Mazda 6. In a world first, every time you brake, a capacitor stores the energy generated, then uses it to save you fuel. And when you accelerate, SkyActiv technology gives sporty performance, saving even more fuel. It's the safest, most advanced Mazda ever. All new Mazda 6. It's driving re-energized.
For dogs who want a powerful friend. For wooden floors that love to be cleaned perfectly. And carpets that will never hide surprises, as well as for those who are in need of a little silence. For those interiors that embrace innovation, or for homes which just like a unique power tool. The new Miele S8, the best vacuum cleaner we have ever built. Miele, immer besser.
Here's to Vegemite, all that vitamin B. And a down price that everyone likes, even poms like me.
Vegemite 600-gram jars are down and staying down to just $7 each. Just $7.
Staying down. Whatever you want. Down. Whatever you need. Down. The big red hand is your savings guarantee. So get it at home. Whatever you do. Prices are down and staying down for you.
When you have power, you spend a lot of time working on your short game.
Introducing you, the new machine from Nespresso. Modular. Intuitive. The new you suits your taste. The you lives like you.
Welcome back to the program. We're talking tonight to Labor's Parliamentary Secretary Andrew Leigh, former Liberal leader John Hewson Jessica Irvine, the National Economics Editor for News Limited, and Liberal MP Paul Fletcher. I want to turn to the budget, which is coming on Tuesday. We've already seen, though, through a number of leaks this week, much of the detail. And Andrew Leigh, I guess the question I have is that why should we believe anything we hear on Tuesday night from Wayne Swan? This time last year, we were told the budget will be in surplus. You'll get an increase in family payments. You'll get another tax cut in 2015. All of those things are gone.
David, every year Treasury does its best job to forecast the revenue for the year ahead, and invariably that estimate doesn't come in bang on. We had some years in the early 2000s of which Treasury underestimated revenue, and this year Treasury has significantly overestimated revenue by $17 billion from the last budget. That's a full 1 percentage point of GDP. It is a massive write-down. And the reason for that is this sort of perfect storm on revenues. Commodity prices have come off, but because 30 central banks around the world want to hold our bonds, the dollar has stayed high. We've had, for the first time basically since the national accounts began, nominal growth running slower than real growth, and because government collects on the dollar value rather than the amount of raw output, that's also reduced government revenues. Low inflation means less bracket creep. There's a host of factors that have led to that revenue write-down. So that's entirely on the revenue side, and that's meant we've had to make a set of tough spending decisions.
Yeah, okay, but revenues are still up, aren't they? About 6%, I think, on last year?
In dollar terms, but I don't know why anyone thinks that's a sensible way of approaching the debate.
Why isn't it?
Well, because the demand for services in Australia is driven by the size of the economy. That's driven.
But the economy hasn't grown by 6%.
The revenues as a share of GDP are at 22% of GDP, down from 24% of GDP
some years ago
in the mid 2000s.
Yeah, I'm talking about year on year. Revenue's up 6%. The economy's not up 6%.
If you look at total government revenue, it is well down on where we expected. It has not kept pace with things like healthcare.
But just drilling down on what you've said here, it is down on what was expected. But did Treasury or the government really think that the dollar would fall?
We do our best projections based on all the available data. These projections are coming out of the boffins in Treasury. I've spent time in Treasury. These are people who are doing their best to forecast what government revenues are going to look like.
But again, it gets back to that original question. If they can be that far out, resulting in the surplus going out the window and various promises as well, why should we believe what we hear on Tuesday night?
Well, what the Treasurer has done over past weeks, and what he will continue to do on Tuesday night, is to level with the Australian people about the fiscal circumstances.
So this year we should believe it?
The Treasurer has been upfront and honest with the Australian people about the situation of the budget. He hasn't been attempting to hide what's going on, to hide the difficulty and the challenges that this faces for the government and, of course, for the opposition as well.
But should there be some sort of caveat on Tuesday night that take all this with a grain of salt, we might be way off again?
Absolutely not. I mean, the Treasurer will present to the Australian people Labor's budget, Labor's plans for the next 4 years, everything we'll do and how we'll go about paying for it. Tony Abbott could do the same on Thursday night, but I doubt he will.
It's perhaps a bit of a flippant question, but it is true, isn't it, that both sides of politics should have a bit of a rider with budget projections and budget commitments, that things can be way off.
And it was ever thus. I don't actually think, if you look back at the sort of revenue revisions we had in the last few years of the Howard government, big revisions on the upside, and now we're having it on the downside. There is a margin for error in every forecast. I've got sort of economists...
Why were they, though, on the projections on the downside under Costello and on the upside under Leigh? Is there an easy answer to that?
Kept predicting that the terms of trade would peak because that seemed like a prudent thing to do, and every year they didn't. So, whoop-de-doo, we've got a lot more revenue. And this year we sort of were not now we're not expecting them to fall, and they have actually fallen, and then you have the impact of the dollar. So, I mean, these things are inherently unknowable. If anyone ever thought that the budget forecasts were written in stone, then they were an idiot. And, I mean, we have this debate every year about the budget.
Yeah.
I mean...
But I think there's another factor here, which is, OK, we can all accept that there is variability. You can't predict with certainty. But if you're prudent, you don't plan to spend every last dollar. You don't plan your spending on the basis of very optimistic assumptions.
What do you plan it on?
No, let's remember Wayne Swan last year projected that he was going to increase revenues from $330 billion to $369 billion. That was a huge increase. In the business world, what you do is you make sure you've taken account of the fact that your plans won't always materialise. This government just keeps spending and spending and spending and has
So what sort of buffer should you have there, and what sort of buffer, therefore, would you suggest that Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey should have?
Well,
because that's going to require a fair bit of cutting if you're going to have some buffer in there to assure against this sort of variability.
Well, the simple point I'm making is that as you do your budgeting, you need to do so with a measure of prudence, and we haven't seen prudence from this government. We've seen a repeated desire to spend on the basis of very optimistic assumptions.
Just what sort of prudence? I mean, do you need 1% of GDP wiggle room?
Can I just finish this point? That the point you came to earlier is absolutely right. While the government is collecting less money than its wildly optimistic assumptions, it will still raise a lot more money this year than last year. And the government needs to be upfront about that. Now, Julia Gillard on radio today said it's not about expenditure, it's about less tax money coming in. It's not about less tax money coming in, it's about less tax money coming in than they expected.
Less than they expected.
Certainly more money than came in last year.
We established that. John Hewson, on this issue of less money coming in than expected, is anyone to blame for this, or is this just...
Well, I think the Treasury forecasts have been pretty wild for the last several years. I mean, last year the original budget estimate number was 12 and it came in at 44. This time it was to be a surplus of 3, and it's going to come in somewhere between 10 and 20 negative deficit. You know, I think that most people commenting on last year's budget said that those numbers were wildly optimistic, that you would not get that sort of revenue. Having said that, I mean, I'm fascinated to hear the extent to which the Prime Minister's going now. I heard her yesterday trying to explain the difference between nominal and real GDP as an explanation for why this happened.
Yeah. Once you start
she lost everybody, including all the economists in the room.
I think you're attacking me then too, aren't you, John? I just had a go at making that argument.
Anyway, yes, I know.
But isn't this good political communication? Shouldn't you have a serious upfront economic argument?
Look, she tried to make it look as if, OK, this is an unusual set of circumstances where you get the divergence between those two. But that doesn't explain away what's been happening for the last several years under this government, and spending has been a fundamentally important part of that. I mean, every time we go to Western Sydney, it's another 40 million for something, whatever. And you know, I think that Swan really has to be very careful how he handles his speech, because last year it was, I'm going to share the benefits of the boom. This year he's got to say, well, I've got to take them all back.
The other thing, that strikes me is that in the last few budgets, the message has been fairly simple from Wayne Swan. We've got a path back to surplus, and we've got to stick to this path back to surplus. Jessica, what is the message now on whether we should be getting back to surplus or not? I mean, the Reserve Bank this week's cut interest rates. It clearly wants to stimulate. But what's Wayne Swan's argument going to be about when and if we should get back to surplus?
Well, there should always be a path back to surplus. It's just a question of how long you take to do it. And I think, you know, every economist was saying, look, it doesn't matter if it's 2012-13, probably doesn't even matter if it's 2013-14. But it does matter if it's going to be 2025, 26. You know, like we've gone completely reverse from having to calm these guys down and say, look, it doesn't matter too much if you're not in surplus this year, to it seeming to be hands off, well, all right, it's irresponsible to get a surplus.
But the budget can cover 4 years, right? The 4-year forward estimates period. Does it matter if there's no surplus in this coming 4 years?
I think it matters politically, and I think, you know, you need to reach for a surplus. You need to set that target, because as we know, there's always slippage. You need to set a target, and then that is, you know, what you work towards. I think, you know, the government has been very reluctant to give any guidance on if there will be a surplus in the forward estimates, or when. I would expect that there's a lot of very busy bodies in Treasury at the moment doing a lot of sort of cost shifting so that they can demonstrate in the last year, you know, that's a path back to surplus. And I think that is actually wise, because if we don't fix things in the next sort of half decade, in the next decade after that, we hit problems with the ageing of the population, and then you really do have a budget problem on top of a budget that's already in.
This is where the numbers, though, are going to be quite meaningless, I think, because two big initiatives by this government, Gonski and the National Disability Insurance Scheme, will not be funded, irrespective of what they say. If you look at the Gonski numbers, I think, if I remember correctly, more than half of it comes in 2018, 2019, sort of beyond the end of the period, and that's not funded. And the National Disability Scheme, we don't know. We don't know what eligibility is going to be. We don't know what definition is going to be of disability. We've got to have these pilot processes to determine those numbers. I've seen numbers between 20 and 30 billion a year for that scheme. That's not going to be funded. And so, you know, I'm sure they'll claim it's funded, and the Prime Minister's going around signing documents and, you know, looking like she's on top of it. I think it's a cruel hoax, quite frankly, because those two things, which are very important, are actually not going to be funded, irrespective of what they say in this budget.
Just, Andrew Leigh, getting back to Jessica's point about the need for a surplus figure somewhere in the forward estimates of this budget. And, you know, I'm not asking you to give us a scoop on what the figures will be, but from an economics point of view, do you agree that it's important to have a surplus in there somewhere?
I think the return to surplus is important, but I think it's also important that we recognise where Australia sits in the world context. When you look around the developed world, it is hard to find another country in which you would rather be looking for a job and you'd rather have a job. Australia's grown 13% since 2007. Europe's shrunk. America's grown only a couple of percentage points. 10% debt to GDP ratio is extraordinarily low looking across the advanced world, and our unemployment rate is low by international standards. So let's not forget that basic starting point when we're talking about the challenges that Australia's fiscal policy makers make. We will do Disability Care Australia. It's going to be funded in the budget. That is a signature initiative of this government.
Well, because at least for the first 4 years before it becomes fully operational.
It'll be locked in. It'll be funded,
David,
and I hope that the coalition will back the levy.
Let's just be clear about how we got to the point of having a very low debt to GDP ratio. We got to that point because of hard work by John Howard and Peter Costello and the Howard government over a substantial period of time. Over the past 5 years now, Wayne Swan has run deficit after deficit after deficit. We're now heading for $170 billion in net debt, and the gross debt number is higher than that. So it's quite extraordinary that we constantly hear Labor politicians saying there's no need to worry because we've got low debt to GDP when they have been consistently pursuing policies to weaken that position. So the fundamental economic point is, unless you can credibly demonstrate that you are pursuing policies to stabilise and get a hold of debt, then you risk losing the confidence of the markets, you risk losing the confidence of the population, and fundamentally Australians know that earning a dollar is hard work and you've got to be careful with it, and they suspect that nobody in this government really understands it or believes it.
But once again, we hear that argument, but we don't hear any acknowledgement that there was a global financial crisis.
There was a global financial crisis, and as we've consistently said, we supported the first tranche of the response to that, but not the second tranche, which was which was wasteful and unnecessary. And you had school halls still being built 3 years after that money was allocated, long after the supposed stimulus effect that was required had passed.
It is extraordinary, isn't it, that years on we're still going to have a debate this election about school halls, pink bats, and all of that stimulus spending.
I mean, as Paul knows, 2/3 of the debt that was taken on the global financial crisis was revenue write-downs rather than stimulus spending. So the question that faced Australian policymakers at the time was, do you want to inject money in and maintain spending, or do you actually want to cut back government while the private sector is cutting back? I left school in the teeth of the last recession of the early 90s. That was a pretty tough time to be an 18-year-old. That period of unemployment blighted many lives.
Hence you went to uni and spent a lot of time there.
Well, that's one rational response by youngsters facing a downturn. But it's easy to forget those hundreds of thousands of individuals who would otherwise have been thrown on the unemployment scrap heap if we hadn't taken on that modest debt in the GFC. Since then, we've offset every new spending measure by an appropriate savings measure. That's been hard to do.
What is your view on this whole argument about whether they spent too much or not?
Yeah, well, the problems didn't start with the Labor government. It goes back to Howard. If you look, I've seen some estimates of the total value of the terms of trade boost. What we got just for doing the same thing but getting paid more was about $300 billion over about a decade. And half of that was spent before Labor got into power in tax cuts worth about $150 billion handed back to Australians, and we've all benefited from that, whether people are still conscious of the fact that that is true. But that is one of the major problems with the budget now, is that taxes on personal income are too low. So now when we have the Medicare levy, that effectively just increases, personal income tax rates, which is fair enough. And I think now when we're looking at reversing personal income tax cuts that were to be associated with the carbon compensation, yes, we don't need those.
I think it's a very important point, because if you go back to the Howard Costello tax cuts and work out what their cost is in this year and next year and the year after, you're talking sort of $50–60 billion numbers. I haven't got precise numbers.
Meaning we'd be in surplus.
We'd be in surplus without those tax cuts. So, I mean, you can't, often in this political game you focus on 1 year at a time. But those sort of significant structural shifts have a continuing, in this case, revenue impact, which is very substantial.
That's effectively an argument that the Howard-Costello government should not have given tax cuts because there was a duty to kind of preserve Labor's capacity to maintain a surplus in the future. Had Labor managed the budget properly in this government...
There's fault on both sides.
If you want a buffer, you could have had a 2–3% of GDP budget buffer, but instead we didn't save that money.
Well,
they spent the benefits of the boom.
I think giving Australians money back to them through tax cuts is a very desirable thing, and that is something on the Liberal Party side we stand for and we won't apologise.
We'll tease that out after the break. We're going to tease that out and see whether you will offer more tax cuts or indeed keep the tax cuts that are currently tied to the carbon tax once you get rid of it. Stay with us after the break.
Think about this. The new Holden Cruise is built here and made exciting. But we're not the only ones who think so. Think new cruise. Think Holden.
New Osterlin OsteoGuard combines 6 key nutrients that help keep your bones stronger for longer. Defend your strength with new Osterlin OsteoGuard.
Coffee can leave stains on your teeth. But Extra Professional White can help reduce these stains to give you a brighter, whiter smile. Extra Professional White, now available in classic soft tabs.
Drink chew. Extra.
It's crazy how good I feel in my skin. Thanks to Age Perfect, the #1 skincare for mature skin, with soya peptides that increase collagen production for anti-dryness, anti-sagging, anti-age spots. Age Perfect from L'Oréal Paris.
Discover the Classic Pocket Watches collection. Timepieces from across the ages with high-quality workings. Every fortnight, collect an elegant pocket watch to treasure and display. And explore the story of watchmaking in your magazine. Classic Pocket Watches, issue 1, only $5.95.
I typed my name and date of birth, and step by step, decades were crossed. When I was lost, my ancestry tree showed me the way that led to you, and I saw you coming home.
With the world's largest online collection of family history records, exploring your family's past has never been easier. Simply type in a name at ancestry.com.au. Who will you discover?
Don't forget some breakfast.
With 5 whole grains and 4 hours of sustained energy release, Belvita breakfast biscuits are specially designed for breakfast. Try new cranberry. Find us in the biscuit aisle.
For dogs who want a powerful friend. For wooden floors that love to be cleaned perfectly. And carpets that will never hide surprises, as well as for those who are in need of a little silence. For those interiors that embrace innovation, or for homes which just like a unique power tool. The new Miele S8, the best vacuum cleaner we have ever built. Miele, immer besser.
Welcome back. We're talking tonight to a panel of economists. Andrew Leigh is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, a former economics professor. So is John Hewson, the former Liberal leader. Jessica Irvine is the National Economics Editor from News Limited, and Paul Fletcher, Liberal MP. I want to turn to the paid parental leave scheme that we've seen some criticism of within your ranks, Paul Fletcher. It's a generous scheme, would offer a replacement salary for women on salaries up to $150,000. They can take 6 months off, so therefore they could get a maximum of $75,000 from the taxpayer. To pay for it, you would have a levy on the biggest companies, 3,000 of the biggest firms. Can you understand the concern that some of your colleagues have about this?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that this is a measure which is designed to improve the participation of women. It's designed to continue to encourage women and families to have children,
which is great,
and improve population. And it's also designed to improve productivity, because every year it seems the percentage of graduates who are women is growing. It's now over 50% in many disciplines. So as a nation, we are investing a lot of money in upskilling women as well as men, and that's a very good thing. But we're then doing the opposite in a sense when they get to the age of having children, because there are significant disincentive effects. So what you're doing is you're increasing the skills, but then you're not taking advantage of that. You're not getting the economic benefit of that. So this is a measure that is designed to improve the participation of women in the workforce, particularly in those critical years of having children, and to improve productivity.
But it does come with a pretty hefty price tag, doesn't it? Now, whether it's $3, $4, $5 billion, the various figures that have been used this week, it's money that's going to have to come through a tax increase. And possibly dipping into the budget as well, but a tax increase on companies that'll have to be passed on will all have to pay more.
Well, what we've said is this scheme it needs to be funded, and we're being very upfront and clear about where the money is coming from. And what we've said is there will be a levy on the largest companies to fund this scheme. Now, it is important, as you announce a major piece of expenditure, that you also announce...
What's the impact of that tax increase, though? Because, you know, we've heard from the opposition for years now that these sort of tax increases that Labor's done, the carbon tax in particular, mining tax, have been a disincentive to investment. Is this going to be a disincentive to investment, or is this tax different somehow to other taxes?
Well, what this is about is increasing the incentive for women to stay in the workforce and to continue to improve their skills.
But I'm asking about the tax increase.
Well, but you have to look at these things in their totality. You have to look at the overall economic impact.
Yeah, but I'm asking specifically about the impact of the tax increase on business investment. Is there no impact? Or is there the similar impact that you've pointed to with other taxes?
Well, you always weigh up the consequences of a tax and then the benefits of the expenditure.
So what's the consequence?
Well, you have, you know, there's a standard tax analysis. There's a lot of highly qualified economists around the table.
What's your analysis?
Any one of them could knock up a model for you.
Please give me your analysis. What's the consequence of the tax hike?
Well, as a standard piece of analysis, you assume that when you increase tax, that has an effect on economic activity, but you need to look at... What's the effect? Well, it's a negative effect, of course, but you need to look at the totality. And the point we're making is that the overall productivity benefits for the economy, the improvement in participation by women, and the fact that our proposal, unlike Labor's, is that women are paid during their maternity leave, during their paid parental leave period, based upon their actual salary up to a cap of $150,000. So it's not a welfare approach; it's a workplace entitlement. So it's a similar approach to sick leave and so on.
Okay, but it will have a negative effect, as you acknowledge, on business. Jessica, it took a while to get that, but is that about it?
Well, the costs have to be borne somewhere, and so it's a question of, does a company that faces a higher tax rate mean that it has less money to pay wage increases to its workers, or does it try to pass on some of that cost to its customers via higher prices, depending on whether they think that people will continue to buy their product? That's a decision that they will make. Either way, you know, we do end up paying for that. So if you are paying women to have children extra, then that means slightly lower wages for everybody that works for that company, or for some of the men as well, or it means that when you go and buy the product of that company, you might pay a bit more.
But as Paul says, it's all about the totality here. Is it worth it for the productivity benefit that might flow from keeping more qualified women in the workforce?
Yeah, well, it's confusing as to whether the coalition is pushing a productivity or an entitlement argument on this. They're sort of trying to push a productivity argument on it, but it's also emerging that it is a sense that women are entitled to some compensation from society for the private work that they do to reproduce the labour force. And why should women bear the financial penalty of that? And why wouldn't you, just like sick leave or care leave,
significant social or public benefit?
Yeah, why shouldn't you be paid something by your company to do that? And I think that is radical feminism at work in the workplace.
from the opposition leader.
From the misogynist.
That's right, John Hewson. You're actually a bit of a fan of
look, I think it's a differentiator for Tony. I think it's very important from that point of view. I mean, both sides of politics support paid parental leave. It's just a question of how much and how it's funded. And there are differences in the how much and how it's funded. But I think what Tony's tried to do with that, and I can't even imagine that he'd back off it. he will deliver this,
No.
whatever the the number emerges to be in terms of cost. It's a commitment, and I think it's clever politics because he's differentiated himself and in a very important area. And look, last week the Prime Minister tried to wedge Tony on the levy for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And the wedge bit her in the behind because actually he agreed immediately that we will have that levy. So then she can hardly criticise him for wanting a levy of his own to fund one of his policies. So I think, the wedge actually didn't work. It actually gave him credibility, and I thought Tony last week looked quite prime ministerial.
Andrew Leigh, on the paid parental leave plan, though, why should a woman on earning $80,000 a year not receive a replacement salary to have a baby?
Well, David, the way our social safety net has always been most effective is because it gives the most to those who are most in need. The typical OECD country gives 5 times as much benefits to someone in the bottom quintile. We give 12 times as much. And that's meant our social safety net has been able to do a lot more. To answer John's question, the difference between...
But just back on this, there are some areas where you don't do that, where you do provide childcare benefits that are not means tested. You pay half the childcare fees for every Australian in the country. It doesn't matter how much they earn. They can earn $1 million and you'll pay half their childcare fees. Why? Why do you do that?
We don't pay someone who is a millionaire 20 times as much as we pay somebody who's on $50,000. But that's the difference with this policy.
Okay, but the argument you've made is one about justice here, essentially, about, we skew government benefits to the lowest income earners, but you don't with childcare benefits. And why is that? It's because it's a family assistance measure to encourage and help families with a young child.
But other parts of our family assistance measures, such as the baby bonus, are targeted. The thing we don't have, and the thing that hasn't been part of the Australian social system, has been benefits that give more to those who have more. That's what this system does. And to answer the question you put directly to Paul, where does it come from? Well, we know the company tax falls on labour. So we know the effect of a higher company tax is lower wages. That's just standard economics. It doesn't come from capital, doesn't come from land, it comes from labour. And so what this is going to do is to reduce many workers' wages so those on the highest incomes can have a lot. And now Mr Abbott, because he's got this costings problem, is looking to restrict it. So he's saying he's going to cut government workers out of the scheme. Now that might include library assistants, it might include childcare workers who work for local government, presumably people who are not women of calibre, according to Mr Abbott.
But let's be clear also, this notion that, the only people who are going to benefit are high paid, that's quite wrong. The notion is that this applies to all women up to a cap of a salary of $150,000 based upon the actual amount that they earn. And so there's a very large number of women. I think the average full-time earnings for women in full-time employment is around $65,000, or roughly. And so we're talking about numbers that are...
And they're the ones at the moment, under your plan, who would only get the minimum wage.
That's right, that's right. So this is really about people who have built up some skill and capacity in the workforce. They're earning a certain level, and then if they stop and take time off with a new baby, they're then facing a significant reduction in their income under the current arrangement.
David, this is not a welfare measure. You're giving more to those who give up more. They give up more to have children. That's I think the key argument, not the welfare argument that you just put into.
But let's...
No, I also like the fact that it's a levy that is paid by all business, irrespective of whether they employ a woman or not. If you go to a firm level and you are faced with a decision as a manager, will I pick boy, will I pick girl? Girl might disappear for 6 months, and what am I going to get out of her? Pick boy, that'll be the certainty, and I'm going to have to bear that cost. If the government's going to pay that anyway for you, it reduces that financial penalty on you for potentially having a woman.
It's not a disincentive to hire a woman.
Yeah, but it does. But still, your woman's as long as it is the case that the woman is going to go off and care for the child and have the primary caring role, that is more the problem than if the employer is blind and doesn't know, well, it might be the man who takes the time off. So I think one of the things with this scheme is that because it's the focus on the woman's wage, we're still assuming it will be the woman who wants to take 6 months off.
It raises an interesting detailed question. I'm going to hit you with this. without notice. But if the man does take the 6 months off, which they're entitled to, what salary do they get? Do they get their salary? If I took 6 months off to look after a new baby, would I get my salary?
No. We've said that 2 weeks of it can be taken in terms of leave for the male partner, but otherwise...
So the father can't take the 6 months?
Well, in terms of the application of this scheme, it's focused on women.
Have the baby.
That's at odds with the current system, where it falls on the primary caregiver.
Yeah, because under your scheme it can be either, can't it?
Well, ours is not a scheme. Ours is the reality. Australia has paid parental leave now.
I could access that.
You could access that.
Just bear in mind one of the policy intentions behind the scheme. Who are the people who are disincented from participating in the workforce today and returning to the workforce? Overwhelmingly, it's women. So that's where we have targeted our policy.
This is just such an extraordinarily expensive policy in order to give large sums of money to the most affluent households. And let's think about the people who are likely to already have parental leave schemes in place. Disproportionately, they're going to be those towards the top of the income spectrum. So effectively, the taxpayer will be crowding out a scheme that is already in place, that companies already have in place. Who does that benefit? Well, that benefits those high-wage firms. But it's not going to have much of an impact on the general population. And I'm frankly pretty worried if Mr Abbott is going to start cutting out government workers from this. Does that include teachers? Does that include police officers? Does it include firefighters? Does it include the many low-wage workers who work for state, local, Commonwealth governments? Would you be seeking assurances on that?
Well, no, just to be clear, the specific notion is that where there is already a scheme in place that applies to public sector workers, you wouldn't separately include them in the scheme.
Sometimes the public service have very generous schemes that are 26 weeks anyway. So
at a replacement. At a replacement.
And if the scheme isn't 26 weeks, do they get to come in on the coalition scheme or not?
Well, no, I'm simply making the point that you will look at the implementation of the scheme against the principles we've articulated. But the principles are very clear in terms of who is going to benefit from the scheme, and the intention is you've got 26 weeks, replacement of your salary up to $150,000. So those are the clear policy parameters.
Exactly how much it'll cost and exactly where the money comes from, we'll find out between now and the election. Not just yet. Tony Abbott has said there'll be much more to say on this before election date. We're right out of time for tonight's show. I feel smarter just sitting around the table with all of you. Andrew Leigh, John Hewson, Jessica Irvine, Paul Fletcher, thanks for joining us. Thanks for your company as well. We'll be back same time next week. See you then.